The Tomlinson and Vance anniversary gala filled Aurelio's with the kind of laughter that costs money, and Joanna Reyes carried a tray of $40 wine through the middle of it in a waitress uniform that still smelled like the dish pit. 18 months ago, she'd argued mergers in that same room as one of Chicago's sharpest young attorneys, 27 now and stripped of everything, her license suspended over a fraud she didn't commit, her savings swallowed by legal fees, her mother's dialysis bills stacking up like a sentence she could never finish paying. She'd learned to keep her chin level and her hands steady, to disappear behind the tray, because invisibility was the only dignity left to a woman the law had used and discarded. Then a voice she knew too well cut across the room. Preston Wade, the man who'd framed her and then married into the partnership, snapped his fingers at her like she was furniture and smiled that polished, cruel smile. "Get me another pour," he said loud enough for his colleagues to turn, "and tell me, still no husband. I warned you, sweetheart. You loved your career a little too much." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the held breath of 200 people, sensing a wound being opened for sport. And into that silence walked a man the whole room had been pretending not to wait for. Tobias Falcone owned Aurelio's, owned the harbor it sat beside, owned half the quiet money in the city and every dangerous secret behind it. 37, dressed in charcoal that fit like it had been stitched onto him, he moved with the unhurried calm of someone who'd never once in his life had to hurry. A faint scar at his jaw, and a stillness in his pale gray eyes that made grown men recalculate. They called him the Wolf of the Docks. His own father had been killed 8 months back, and the city still whispered about who'd answer for it. Preston's smirk faltered as Falcone crossed the floor, and everyone braced for him to pass them by. He didn't. He stopped in front of the waitress with the trembling tray, and then, impossibly, this man who bowed to no one lowered his head and took her hand. "There you are," he said, his voice low enough that the room leaned in to steal it. "I've been looking for you all night." He turned to the frozen crowd, to Preston, to the partners who'd ruined her, and spoke 4 words that rearranged every assumption in the building. "This is my wife." Joanna had never seen him before in her life, and the most powerful, most feared man in Chicago had just claimed her in front of the people who'd spent a year teaching her she was nothing. If a story about a woman finding her power, when everyone wrote her off, speaks to you, smash that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that no one gets to decide your worth but you. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single chapter of what happens next. Now, let's go back to that frozen ballroom and find out exactly what kind of deal a desperate waitress and a ruthless mafia boss are about to strike. His hand was still holding hers as he led her out of the banquet room, not hurriedly, not tightly, only with a warm, certain weight that made the entire crowd part automatically on either side like water before the prow of a ship. Joanna let herself be led away for the only reason she could admit to herself, that standing still beneath 200 staring eyes was worse than following the man who had just turned her from the joke of the room into the mystery of the entire evening. He pushed open the glass door, leading to the balcony overlooking the harbor, where the October wind from Lake Michigan blew up cold and briny, then closed the door behind them, cutting off the music and whispers until they became a distant sound, as if echoing from another world. Joanna pulled her hand free from his the instant the door closed, took 1 step back, and when she spoke, her voice did not tremble but was as sharp as the blade she had once used in boardrooms. "Who are you to stand there and say I'm your wife? I've never met you in my life." Tobias Falcone did not answer right away. He leaned against the stone railing, both hands in his pockets, studying her with the calm of a man accustomed to observing people the way one studies pieces on a board. And when he spoke, his voice was so low and steady it only made her more guarded. "You're right, we've never met. This is the first time, and I'm sorry for the way I chose to begin it." He tilted his head slightly toward the door, toward the room where Preston was still standing frozen. "I was on the mezzanine the whole time. I heard him snap his fingers at you like he was calling an animal. I saw that you didn't drop the tray, didn't cry, didn't run. You just stood there and kept your back straight. I've seen powerful men collapse over less than that." Joanna folded her arms across her chest, hating the way his words touched some place inside her that she had thought had gone numb. "So this is pity. You saw a server being humiliated, so you put on a hero's little performance. Thank you. You can leave now, and I still have a shift to finish." She turned to go back inside, and just as her hand touched the door handle, he said a sentence that froze her whole body. I need a wife, Miss Reyes, for 90 days. And I need a mind that understands the law better than anyone I'm paying. She turned back slowly, her brows drawing together, the disbelief on her face, mixing with something she did not want to call curiosity. You're insane. People don't walk into a party and choose a wife the way they choose an appetizer. You have this whole city at your feet, dozens of women ready to kneel for a single glance from you. Why a disbarred server? He did not deny what she had just said, and it was that lack of denial that made him frightening. Because I don't need someone who kneels. I need someone who can read between the lines of a contract and see the trap hidden on the 40th line. I need someone who doesn't belong to my world, who owes no one in it a favor, and who's smart enough to know exactly what she's signing. He paused, his gray eyes never leaving her face. The reason I need it urgently is my own business, and I'll tell you when I trust you enough to tell you. For now, all you need to know is that this isn't pity. It's a business proposal. Joanna let out a soft laugh, bitter and exhausted. A business proposal. Do you know what happened the last time I believed in a business proposal? I lost my career, my honor, everything I had ever built. I have nothing left for you to buy, Mr. Falcone. She moved to leave again, and this time he did not stop her with his hand but with his words. The Hartwell Holdings case, the forged documents they pinned on you. I know you didn't do it. She went still, her whole body turned cold, and not because of the wind. I know who really changed those numbers, who signed the memorandum and then erased his own trail, and who sat there silently while you took the blame to save him. Tobias stepped away from the railing and came one step closer to her, his voice dropping until it was almost gentle. The man who snapped his fingers at you in there, Miss Reyes. I know what Preston Wade did to you. The only question is whether you want to sit down and hear the rest. Preston's name hung in the cold air between them, and Joanna realized she was no longer holding the tray, though she could not remember when she had set it down. She looked at this man for a long time, trying to find in that calm face some sign of deception, some loose thread of a trap, but all she saw was the patience of someone who knew he was holding something the other person needed. All right, she said slowly, and her voice had changed. No longer the voice of a humiliated server, but the voice of the lawyer who had once made entire boardrooms fall silent. If you want to talk business, then we talk business properly. I don't enter into anything because of a promise spoken into the wind. I want everything in writing. Something flickered in Tobias's eyes, not annoyance, but something close to amusement, as though she had just confirmed what he had already guessed. I was hoping you would say exactly that, he answered. Joanna stepped to the railing, standing beside him but keeping enough distance to feel that she still controlled the situation, then began listing terms as if dictating them to a secretary. First, a full contract, legally enforceable to whatever extent an agreement like this can be enforceable, clearly stating a term of 90 days, not 1 day more. Second, a clear exit clause. Whenever I want to end it, I have the right to end it, without explanation, without compensation, with no consequences following me after this is over. She glanced at him to see his reaction, and when he only gave a slight nod, she continued, this time her voice softening at a place she could not hide quickly enough. Third, my mother. She is on dialysis 3 times a week, and I am drowning under medical bills. I want all her medical expenses taken care of, completely, for the duration of the agreement, and not cut off no matter how things between us end. She drew a breath, and fourth, you said you know I'm innocent. Then I want you to help me take back what Preston stole from me. I want the process of restoring my law license reopened properly and legally. I don't need you to use money or power to pressure anyone. I only need the truth placed on the desk of the people with authority. I'll handle the rest myself. Tobias listened without interrupting, his gray eyes following every expression that moved across her face, and when she finished, he was silent long enough that she began to think she had asked for too much. Then he turned fully toward her. Agreed. All of it, he said so simply that it left her stunned. Your mother will be transferred to the best doctors in the city this week. The contract will be on your desk within 48 hours, with the exit clause written exactly as you requested. And as for Preston Wade, you won't have to walk into that battle alone anymore. You never had a fair chance. This time you will. Joanna looked at him, and a strange feeling rose inside her, deep suspicion mixed with something far more dangerous, hope. Why are you doing all of this so easily? She asked quietly. People don't give anyone anything for free, especially people like you. A very faint smile passed over the corner of his mouth, not exactly warm, but not as cold as she had expected either, because you didn't ask for yourself first. You asked for your mother, then for justice. Most people who sit at a negotiating table with me begin with greed. You began with something else. That tells me you are exactly the kind of person I need. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out a plain business card with no company name, no title, only a line of numbers, and placed it in her palm. When she lowered her eyes to the finely embossed mark on the back, her whole body went cold for the second time that night. It was the logo of Aurelio's. "You own this restaurant," she whispered, lifting her eyes to him. "I've been working under you for months without even knowing it. You have been pouring wine for my guests for 11 weeks, Miss Reyes," Tobias said, and this time his gaze carried a weight that made her heart stumble. "It took me only one evening to realize I had hired the wrong person for the wrong position." 4 days later, a black unmarked car stopped in front of Joanna's cramped apartment, and the man who stepped out to open the door for her was built like a brick wall, broad shoulders, close-cropped salt and pepper hair, and calm eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Connor Brady. He introduced himself, his voice low and even, taking her small suitcase before she could reach for it. "I'm in charge of security for Mr. Falcone. From now on, that includes you." All along the drive north along the lakeshore, Joanna sat silently studying the man behind the wheel, and what drew her attention was not his size but the way he spoke of Tobias, not with the fear of a hired man, but with something close to reverence, tempered through many years. When she asked how long he had worked for the Falcone family, Connor only answered briefly that he had once served under Tobias's father, and that there were vows a man kept even after the person who received that vow was gone, and she let the sentence sink into silence because she could feel in it a weight she did not yet fully understand. The Falcone mansion appeared behind a tall iron gate, a solemn block of gray stone tucked among rows of leafless trees, beautiful in a cold and discreet way, much like its owner. The person waiting for her at the door was not Tobias but a woman of about 60, slender yet perfectly straight, dressed in simple dark clothes and wearing a single silver necklace, her sharp eyes sweeping Joanna from head to toe as if appraising a suspicious item. "So this is the girl all Chicago is talking about," the woman said, making no effort to hide her scrutiny. "I'm Gia, Tobias's aunt. I take care of the things my nephew has no time to concern himself with, and right now you are one of those things." Joanna did not lower her eyes, did not bow her head, only extended her hand with the composure she had sharpened through hundreds of first meetings with opponents who wanted to diminish her. "Joanna Reyes. And I'm not a thing to be taken care of, Mom. I'm a party to a signed agreement." For a brief moment there was silence, then the corner of Gia's mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but no longer pure contempt either. "Stubborn, good, soft people don't survive long in this house." She led Joanna through still hallways lined with dark paintings, speaking as they walked in the voice of a woman who had spent her life memorizing unwritten rules. "You need to understand a few things before stepping into this world, Miss Reyes, because innocence here is not a virtue. It is a death sentence. In this house, you never bow your head to anyone except Tobias, even if they are older than you, more powerful than you, or seem kinder than you. Every gesture carries meaning, every word has its price, and trust here is not something given freely. It's something bought with blood." Joanna remembered every word, not because she was afraid, but because her professional instinct recognized that this, too, was only another kind of contract, with hidden terms that needed to be decoded. As they passed an open doorway, she briefly saw Connor standing beside Tobias in the study, his head slightly bowed as he listened to his employer with absolute focus, and she noticed the way Tobias placed a hand on the guard's shoulder for one brief moment, a rare intimate gesture between two men who had spent their whole lives hiding every emotion. Gia caught her glance and said quietly, almost to herself, "Connor is the only person in this house Tobias can turn his back on without fear. My nephew buried his father 8 months ago, and since then he hasn't trusted anyone except that man." Joanna looked after Connor's steady figure, sensing that in an entire world built from suspicion and betrayal, he was the only unshakable anchor, and somehow that thought gave her a strange sense of comfort. That night, standing by the window of her room and looking down at the black surface of the lake, she realized she had just stepped into a wolf's den, and the most frightening thing was not the danger, but the feeling that among these cold people, for the first time in a very long time, someone was truly seeing her. The contract was brought to her room the next morning, placed inside a black leather briefcase with a silver-plated pen, and Joanna sat down at the oak desk with the familiar feeling of a woman returning to the one thing that had never betrayed her, her ability to read the language of people who wanted to bind others. She read slowly, carefully, in the way 18 months of carrying trays could not wear away, her finger moving over every line, every clause, every comma, placed exactly where it was for a reason. The clause about the 90-day term was exactly where she had demanded it be. The clause about her mother's medical expenses was written clearly, with no loopholes. The exit clause was there too, clean and just as promised. But when her eyes reached the near final page, to a paragraph skillfully hidden among the confidentiality provisions, her whole body went cold and her finger stopped. It was written in legal language so smooth that an ordinary person would have skimmed past it without noticing. But Joanna was not ordinary, and she read it 3 times to make certain she was not misunderstanding. The clause stated that no matter how the agreement ended, even if she invoked her right to withdraw, she would be permanently bound by an obligation of absolute silence about everything she witnessed in Tobias's world, and violating it would place her under a kind of jurisdiction that did not belong to any court at all. In other words, once she knew too much, she would never truly be free to walk away. She took the whole file and went straight down to the study without knocking, then laid it on the desk in front of Tobias with a dry, hard sound. "You told me the exit clause would be clean," she said, her voice calm, but every word edged with ice. "You forgot to mention that even if I walk out of this door, I'll still be carrying an invisible chain around my throat for the rest of my life." Tobias looked up from the papers he was reading, his gaze shifting from her to the contract page she was pointing at, and for an instant she saw something pass over his face that she had not expected. Not the confusion of a man caught in a lie, but a weary resignation, as if he had known this moment would come. "That is a standard clause," he said slowly. "Everyone who enters my world signs something similar. It exists to protect the people in my family, people who would die if secrets fell into the wrong hands." Joanna placed both hands on the desk and leaned toward him. "I don't care how standard it is. I care that you sat on that balcony and told me this was an agreement between 2 equals. Then wrote a clause in here that turns me into your property even after everything ends. One of those 2 things is a lie, Mr. Falcone, and I want to know which one." The room fell silent long enough for her to hear the clock ticking on the mantel. Then Tobias did something she was completely unprepared for. He reached for his fountain pen, pulled the contract closer, turned to that exact page, and with one straight, decisive stroke, crossed out the entire clause, then initialed his name beside the line. "Done," he said, pushing the file back toward her. "That clause no longer exists. If one day you want to leave, you leave with complete freedom, and you take everything you know with you. I am placing the safety of the people I love in your trust, a woman I have just met. That is something I have never done with anyone." Joanna looked at the ink that had not yet dried, then looked up at his face, and she realized with a confusion that made her heart sink that the man the whole city called the Wolf had just removed one of his sharpest fangs simply because she had dared ask him to do it. "Why?" she asked softly, almost without sound. "Because," he answered, his gray eyes holding hers, "I have spent an entire life among people who obey only because they are afraid. I think it is time I see what happens when someone stays because they choose to stay." That night she could not sleep, and when the clock had passed midnight, she went downstairs in search of a glass of water, only to catch a spill of golden light through the half-open study door. Tobias was sitting alone by the fireplace without his jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, an untouched glass of liquor resting on the arm of his chair, and in the flickering firelight, without the calm, cold mask of the evening, he looked older than his years, tired in the way of a man carrying a burden he could not put down. He looked up and saw her standing at the threshold, and instead of sending her away, he only tipped his head slightly toward the chair opposite him, a silent invitation. She sat down, and for a long while they were both quiet, watching the fire, until he spoke, his voice low and distant, as if he were talking to himself. "You once asked why I needed a wife so urgently. I think you deserve the real answer, after what you dared demand from me this morning." He turned the glass lightly in his hand, watching the fire fracture through the crystal. 8 months ago, My father was killed. Right in the middle of a party, among people he called friends, by a bullet no one saw coming or knew where it came from. I was less than 10 steps away from him. I was the one who caught him as he went down. Joanna said nothing. She only sat still, and she understood that sometimes silence was the greatest gift one could give to someone opening an old wound. When a leader falls without a steady successor, an entire world begins to crack, he continued. There is a council, families that coexist in this city through agreements more fragile than people imagine. They looked at me and saw an unmarried man, a man with nothing to lose, nothing to anchor him. In our world, a man like that is considered unstable, and instability is an invitation for others to tear him apart. They gave me 90 days to prove I was steady enough to sit in my father's chair, and a wife, a visible form of stability, was the price they set. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes there was a rawness she had never seen before. I needed someone smart enough not to be swallowed, strong enough to stand among wolves without trembling, and outside enough for me to know she would not betray me over some old blood feud in this world. I found all of that in a woman carrying a tray of wine and refusing to cry in front of the man who destroyed her. Joanna felt something shift inside her chest, but she kept her voice steady. People say you're ruthless. They call you the wolf. I need to know what kind of man I'm standing beside. Tobias did not avoid the question. I have done things that keep me from sleeping easily. I won't lie to you about that. But there is one line I have never crossed, and never will. I do not touch the innocent, the uninvolved, the people who only happen to be standing in the wrong place. Anyone in my world knows the rules of the game when they walk in. But an outsider, someone who had no choice, no. That is the one thing I still keep from the person who taught me that even in darkness, a man must leave himself something to hold on to. She looked at him for a long time, then asked a quiet question, one perhaps no one had ever asked him before. Were you ever given a choice? This life, this world, this chair, did anyone ever ask whether you wanted it, or were you simply born inside it? Tobias went silent, and in that moment, the crackle of the fire filled the space between them. When he answered, his voice was so soft that she almost had to lean forward to hear him. No, he said. No one has ever asked me that, until tonight. And Joanna realized, with an ache that surprised her, that the most powerful man in Chicago had just confessed the very thing she had lived with for the past 18 months. That sometimes what breaks us is not the burden itself, but the fact that no one sees us carrying it. The introduction before the council took place 1 week later, inside an old mansion, hidden behind rows of ancient oak trees on the northern edge of the city, where the most powerful families gathered beneath crystal chandeliers and smiles that never reached their eyes. Joanna entered on Tobias's arm, wearing a deep wine-colored dress Gia had chosen for her, and his aunt had reminded her again and again that every glance in this room was a test, every question a trap wrapped in velvet. She kept her back straight, held her chin at exactly the height Gia had taught her, and felt dozens of cold eyes measuring her as though she were a suspicious object newly brought into the house. The first man to approach them had smooth silver hair, and a smile that immediately made her think of a blade hidden inside silk. Silas Kane, he introduced himself, lifting his glass toward Tobias while his eyes locked on her. So this is the wife the whole city is whispering about. I must admit, Falcone, you've made all of us curious. A lady from the glittering world of law, suddenly lowering herself to step into our house. I keep wondering how much an arrangement like this is valued at, and who is the one truly paying the price. His words were smooth, but the trap was clear. A snare meant to force her either to admit this was a purchased marriage or to stammer in denial and reveal weakness. Joanna smiled, and when she spoke, her voice was as calm as the surface of a still lake. Mr. Kane, I notice you chose the phrase paying the price very carefully. But I'm afraid you're confusing value with cost, a mistake often made by people who are used to buying and selling everything. A good agreement has no true payer and false payer. It has only two parties who both understand exactly what they are receiving and what they are giving. If you are truly curious about the terms of our agreement, I'm afraid you will have to negotiate a copy of your own, because mine is not permitted to be disclosed to a third party. A brief silence passed, then a few quiet laughs rose from somewhere in the crowd, and Kane's smile stiffened at the corners. He did not give up easily, but shifted the angle of attack, his voice turning sweeter. Clever. But I heard you were once very clever in another boardroom, before you lost everything over a signature placed in the wrong spot. People say you forged documents. I only wonder whether Falcone knows he is inviting a fraud to sit at our table. It was the cruelest strike, a blow aimed straight at the wound she had thought was safely hidden, and the entire room held its breath to see whether she would collapse. But Joanna had lived with that pain far too long to be knocked down by it anymore. Mr. Kane, you have just made a mistake any apprentice lawyer is taught to avoid, which is confusing an accusation with a verdict. I have never been convicted by any court of forging anything. My license was suspended based on the testimony of a man who had every reason to lie, and the review of that truth is already underway. If you wish to use rumors as weapons in this room, I suggest you choose one that is harder to overturn. Because the thing I do best, sir, is expose numbers someone has deliberately put in the wrong place. This silence was different, heavier and touched with respect, and Joanna realized the whole room had just looked at her with new eyes. It was then that Tobias stepped half a pace forward, placing himself beside her as an equal, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but everyone in the room heard every word. I want everyone here to understand one thing clearly, he said, his gray eyes moving slowly through the room before stopping on Kane. This woman is not my guest, not my ornament, and certainly not something anyone in this room may dissect for amusement. She is my wife. Whoever insults her insults me, and I believe we all understand the price of that. Kane bowed his head and stepped back, his smile gone completely, and in the moment Tobias turned to look at her, Joanna saw something in his eyes that she knew had never been written into any contract. Toward the end of the evening, when Tobias was drawn into a corner of the room by a group of family heads to discuss matters not meant for her ears, Joanna withdrew into the empty hallway to find a moment of quiet for lungs that had grown tight from cigar smoke and scrutiny. She stood beside a tall window overlooking the dark garden, just beginning to loosen the shoulders that had been tense for hours, when a smooth voice sounded behind her and made her turn sharply. Silas Kane stood there, a glass of wine in his hand, his smile no longer carrying the attack of earlier, but something almost friendly instead, and that change made her more cautious than anything. "Do not misunderstand what happened in there," he said, stepping up beside her at the window while keeping a polite distance. "I have no personal dislike for you, Miss Reyes. In fact, I think you are the smartest person to step into that room in many years. That is precisely why I thought you deserved to hear a truth, something rarer than gold in this world." Joanna did not answer, only looked at him with the composure she had sharpened, and her silence seemed to be exactly what he was waiting for. "Do you know why Tobias's father died?" Kane asked softly, his eyes on the dark garden instead of on her. "This whole city whispers about outside enemies, about a bullet from the shadows. But those of us who have lived long in this world know another truth. A strong head like his father does not fall because of a stranger. He falls because he turns his back on someone he should never have trusted." She felt a chill crawl down her spine, but kept her voice flat. "If you know something specific, Mr. Kane, then that room is where you should say it, not whisper it to the wife of the man you just tried to humiliate." Kane let out a soft laugh, seeming amused by her sharpness. "You still do not understand the rules of the game here. In this world, no one says what they know. They only plant it in someone else's ear and stand back to watch it grow. I do not have proof to place on the table, and even if I did, why would I help Falcone? I am telling you for a far more selfish reason. You are new, you are an outsider, and you are the only person in that house who has not yet been bought or bound by old debts. You have something no one else has, eyes that can still see clearly." He turned to look straight at her, and for the first time that entire evening, the smile vanished completely from his face. "The wolf you just married is standing inside a house he believes is safe, and that is the most dangerous thing of all. He guards against enemies at the gate and forgets that the sharpest knife always comes from a hand he has turned his back on. His father once thought he was safe too, right until the very last second." Joanna swallowed hard, fighting to keep her face from revealing the storm rising inside her. "Why are you telling me this? What do you gain?" Kane shrugged, and his casualness was more frightening than any threat. "Perhaps I only want to see what happens when someone who can still recognize the truth walks into a house full of people who have been blind for too long. Or perhaps I am only an old man who enjoys sowing unrest among his rivals. You may choose which way to believe it. But if one day you begin noticing numbers that do not match, doors closing at exactly the moment you approach, people smiling at you a little too widely, Then remember that tonight, someone warned you first." Then he lifted his glass to her with polished courtesy, turned, and blended back into the crowd, leaving Joanna alone beside the window with a seed of doubt newly planted inside her. She told herself those were only the words of an enemy trying to divide them, a move in a game she did not yet fully understand, and she should not let it take root. But when she returned to the banquet room and looked around at the familiar faces surrounding Tobias, for the first time she found herself wondering, if only for one quiet instant, whether one of those smiles was hiding a knife. They left the party when the night was already late, and all the way back to the mansion, Joanna sat silently beside Tobias in the dark car, Kane's warning still echoing somewhere in her mind like a sound she could not turn off. She glanced at the man beside her, watched the way the streetlights passed over his profile in steady intervals, and wondered whether he knew, whether inside a world he believed was safe, someone might already be sharpening a blade. When the car stopped at the entrance and they stepped into the long, quiet hallway of the house, Connor silently withdrew toward the gate, leaving the two of them alone beneath the gentle golden light. And it was in that still moment, after an entire night of playing their parts, that exhaustion and something else made them both stop at the foot of the stairs instead of going separately to their rooms. "You did well tonight," Tobias said softly, turning to look at her, and this time his voice held none of the calculation of an employer evaluating a subordinate, but something close to gentleness. "I've seen people who have lived their whole lives in that world tremble in front of Silas Kane. You made him step back with only a few sentences." Joanna gave a small laugh, tired but real. "I spent my whole career learning how not to let other people see that I was afraid. Apparently that skill still works, just in a different boardroom." She meant to say something more about Kane, about the warning, but when she looked up, she caught the way he was watching her, and every word vanished from her mind. It was not the gaze of the wolf the whole city feared, nor the cold gaze of the man on the balcony that first night, but the gaze of someone who had not allowed himself to want anything for far too long, and was now looking at the thing he wanted standing right in front of him. The distance between them seemed to close on its own, without either of them taking a deliberate step, and when he lifted his hand, his fingers touched her cheek with a strange caution for a man accustomed to giving orders, as if he were afraid she would disappear if he touched too hard. She should have stepped back. In her mind, the voice of reason reminded her that this was only a contract, that feeling was not a clause written on any page they had signed, that she had once given trust to a powerful man and been crushed by it. But she did not step back, and when he bent down, their kiss was slow and quiet, not a performance for 200 pairs of eyes like their entrance in the banquet room, but something real, meant for no one but themselves, in an empty hallway with no audience to convince. In that moment, Joanna felt time loosen around her, felt his warmth and the unexpected tenderness in the way he held her, and she realized with a sudden fear that she had not been acting, that her heart had silently crossed a line she had sworn she would never cross. That thought made her the one to pull away first. She stepped back half a pace, placed a faintly trembling hand against his chest, and when she spoke, her voice had gone hoarse. "This isn't in the contract." Tobias did not move closer either, only stood still, and she saw in his eyes a struggle that mirrored her own, as though he too had just realized he had stepped into territory he had never permitted himself to enter. "No," he answered quietly, his hand lowering. "It isn't." They stood in silence for one long moment, their breathing not yet steady, and then, as though both had wordlessly agreed that they had just touched something too dangerous to name, she nodded to him and turned to climb the stairs, each step heavy with the feeling of gray eyes watching from behind. That night, lying in the room overlooking the black surface of the lake, Joanna forced herself to think about Kane's warning, about knives hidden behind smiles, about every reason she had to keep her heart locked. But the only thing she could feel, lingering and impossible to chase away, was the warmth of a hand that had been taught to cause fear, and yet had touched her so gently. The phone call came near dawn, and just from hearing the trembling voice of Maeve, her closest friend and the nurse, who had been beside her mother through the darkest months, Joanna knew something was wrong before she even heard the rest of the sentence. Her mother had fallen ill during the night and had been taken to the emergency room, and in that moment, Joanna's entire world narrowed down to one fear, the the fear that she would lose the last person left in this world who belonged to her. She rushed down the stairs in a hastily thrown-on coat, her hands shaking so badly she could not fasten the buttons, and before she even had time to call a taxi, Connor was already standing by the door with the car keys in his hand, as if he had known in advance, as if this whole house operated by a rhythm she did not yet understand. All the way through the empty streets before dawn, she clasped her hands together and prayed to something she had long stopped believing in, and when the car stopped in front of the hospital, she knew at once that something did not fit. This was not the public hospital, where her mother had been receiving dialysis, where she knew the crowded hallways and the endless waiting lists. This was a private hospital, bright and quiet, the kind of place where, with the money she had, she would not even have dared walk through the door. A nurse led her through polished stone corridors to a quiet private room where her mother was resting, stabilized, cared for by the best doctors, surrounded by every good thing money could buy, and Joanna stood frozen at the threshold, unable to understand how any of this could have happened. She asked who had transferred her mother here, though somewhere inside her, she had already begun to guess the answer. "Everything was arranged in advance, miss," the nurse answered gently. "All expenses have been handled. Your mother has been on our priority patient list since last week. We were only waiting for tonight to bring her in." Joanna turned to Connor, who stood silently behind her, and he only gave a small nod, confirming what she had already understood. Tobias had done this. He had done it days ago, quietly, without a word of warning, without once mentioning it, without turning it into a debt she would have to carry. She sat down beside her mother's bed, took that familiar thin hand into hers, and the pressure that had been crushing her for 18 months suddenly broke open inside her, like a dam no longer able to hold. All that time, she had carried everything alone, stayed awake alone over the bills, swallowed the humiliation of carrying trays alone, stood alone in a world where no hand had ever reached out to steady her. And now, for the first time, someone had silently lifted part of that weight for her, without asking anything in return. She began to cry, not from grief, but from something she had forgotten the feeling of, being cared for. When she returned to the mansion after full daylight had come, she found Tobias in the study, and she stood at the threshold, her eyes still red, not knowing how to begin. She said softly that he did not have to do that it was not written in any clause, that he could have simply paid the bills as promised, and that would have been enough. But he had done more than that. He had done it as if her mother were one of his own. Tobias set down the book in his hand, and for a long while he said nothing, only looked out the window where morning light was pouring in. "My mother died when I was 12, he finally said, his voice low and distant. She was innocent, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a war that was not hers. I stood there and I could do nothing, because I was only a child, and because no one reached out to help us when we needed it most." He turned to look at her, and in those gray eyes was an old pain that had never healed. "I promised myself that if I ever had enough power, I would never stand by and watch an innocent person suffer when I could stop it. Your mother does not deserve to lie on a waiting list, Joanna. No one does." And standing there, looking at the man the whole city called the wolf speak of his mother in the voice of a boy who had never stopped hurting, Joanna felt something inside her quietly surrender, and she knew, with a certainty that warmed and terrified her at once, that she had begun to love him, in the days that followed. Once her mother had stabilized, and part of the weight had been lifted from her shoulders, Joanna began looking for a way to repay him, in the only way she knew, by doing exactly what Tobias had hired her to do, using her legal mind to help him see what others did not. He had given her access to part of the financial records of the legitimate businesses the Falcone family operated as the visible surface of the iceberg, the restaurants, the real estate companies, the docks and warehouses along the harbor, and he wanted her to review them for legal vulnerabilities his enemies might exploit. She threw herself into the work, with the intensity of someone being handed back what had been taken from her, sitting for hours in the study among stacks of ledgers and reports, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt like herself again, sharp, alert, and useful. It was in the middle of that focus, late one night when the whole house had fallen silent, that she found the first thing that made her stop. A number did not match. A small sum of money had been transferred from one of the family's real estate companies to another business she had never heard of, and from there, It had been split into smaller pieces and moved through 2, then 3 more layers of intermediary companies, each layer appearing perfectly legitimate. Each transaction wrapped in accounting language smooth enough to survive an ordinary glance. But Joanna did not glance. She read, she followed. She did the very thing that had once made her one of the best lawyers in Chicago before everything was stolen from her, patiently untangling every knot in a maze built precisely to make people give up. The deeper she went, the more she realized those intermediary companies were nothing but empty shells, with no real business operations, no employees, no address beyond a mailbox, created for the sole purpose of making the money trail so hazy that no one could trace where it went. This was not a vulnerability an enemy could exploit. This was a pathway someone inside the family had designed to siphon money out quietly, steadily, over many months, without anyone noticing. Her heart beat faster as she traced her way to the final layer of the maze, to the name hidden behind all those shells, and when she saw it, a chill ran down her spine. Every thread, once untangled to the end, led back to one person, a name she had heard mentioned a few times over dinners at the mansion. Always spoken with respect, always described as one of the most loyal pillars remaining from Tobias's father's time, the uncle who had stood beside him through the darkest months after his brother's death. Hal. Joanna sat motionless for a long time before the screen in the papers, Silas Kane's vague warning from that night in the old mansion, suddenly ringing in her head with perfect clarity, no longer sounding like an enemy sowing unrest, but like a finger pointing straight at what she had just found for herself. The sharpest knife always came from a hand a person had turned his back on. She told herself to stay calm, to be certain, because an accusation like this, aimed at someone Tobias trusted so deeply, could not be spoken aloud based only on a few suspicious numbers. She had once been the victim of that very thing, once been destroyed by rushed conclusions built on arranged evidence, and she swore she would never do that to someone else. She needed more. She needed a chain of evidence so tight that no one could deny it, twist it, or throw it back onto her the way Preston had done. And so, instead of running to find Tobias at once, she began quietly digging deeper, pulling older records, comparing more transactions, printing the important pages and hiding them carefully. She had no idea that every query she made, every record's door she quietly opened in the night, was leaving behind a very thin trace, and that somewhere in the darkness of this house, a pair of eyes had begun to notice that the wolf's new wife was searching for things she was never supposed to search for. For the next 2 days, Joanna carried her secret like a live coal hidden in the palm of her hand, and she grew more and more certain that the only person she could entrust this to was Tobias. But she wanted her chain of evidence to be perfect before placing it in his hands, because she knew an accusation against his own uncle would be a knife driven into a heart already full of wounds. On the second night, unable to sleep, she went downstairs to retrieve a few more files she had stored in the study, and as she passed the hallway leading out to the back garden, she heard a low male voice drifting in from the dark porch. She stopped, slipping into the shadow of a doorway, and through the blurred glass, she saw Connor standing alone outside, his phone pressed to his ear, his familiar solid figure outlined against the night sky. She would have kept walking if she had not caught a few broken fragments of his words through the cracked door, and those fragments froze her whole body. Connor's voice was lowered, cautious, the voice of someone who did not want to be overheard. She heard him say something about everything being arranged, that he did not need to worry, that Connor would handle his part when the time came. And then, clear enough that there could be no mistake, she heard him say the name that had haunted her for the past 2 days. Hal. Joanna stood motionless in the dark, her heart pounding so hard she feared Connor might hear it, and a deep cold spread through her as her mind began fitting the pieces together in the worst possible way. Connor, the loyal guard whom Gia herself had called the only man Tobias could turn his back on without fear, the man she had trusted from the very first day, the man who had silently been waiting with the car keys on the night her mother was taken to the hospital. If he too was part of Hal's scheme, then it meant no one in this house could be trusted, and the path to Tobias she had believed was safe was in fact being guarded by the very person closest to him. She backed away step by step in the darkness, trying not to make a sound, and when she reached her room, she leaned against the locked door and struggled to breathe, trying to tell herself she could not be certain, that she had heard only a few broken pieces of a conversation. That perhaps there was an explanation she did not yet know, but she had lived too long in a world where trust had been turned into a weapon, had been ruined once already by her own innocence, and the instinct to protect herself screamed inside her that she could not take the risk. She had trusted Preston. She had once believed that if she was honest and did what was right, the truth would protect her by itself, and that belief had cost her everything. She would not make that mistake again. For the rest of the night, she sat by the window looking down at the dark garden, turning over every face in this house inside her mind, and for the first time since she had stepped through that iron gate, she felt completely alone. She could not hand the evidence to Connor to take to Tobias, because she did not know which channel of information remained clean. She could not trust Gia, who carried the blood of this family, along with debts and calculations Joanna did not fully understand, and she could not go straight to Tobias without a chain of evidence as solid as stone, because if she wrongly accused someone he trusted most, he would never believe her again, and she would push herself out of the only circle that could protect her. When dawn began to break over the lake, Joanna came to a decision that filled her with fear and a strange hard courage at once. She would do this herself. She would build the chain of evidence herself, alone, in secret, trusting no one until she held something undeniable in her hands. She had once been prey arranged to fall. This time, she would be the one arranging the board, and she would not let anyone, not even the man she was falling in love with, know what she was doing until everything was ready. But Joanna did not know that while she was quietly weaving her own net, another net had already been spread to catch her, and it was pulled tight on the very evening she believed she was still safe. She was sitting in the study with Tobias, the two of them reviewing a dock contract, a moment that felt almost ordinary, almost warm, when the door opened without a knock and Hal walked in. It was the first time she truly looked closely at the man behind those murky numbers, a man nearing 60 with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, and a kindly face so gentle it made her shiver, because she knew what that gentleness was hiding. Behind him came two men she did not recognize, and in Hal's hand was a folder. "Tobias," he said, his voice heavy with perfectly performed sorrow, "there is something I prayed I would never have to bring to you, but I would rather break your heart with my own hands than let you be stabbed in the back." He placed the folder on the desk and opened it, and when Joanna saw what was inside, her whole body went cold. There were photographs of her from months earlier, back when she was still a lawyer, sitting in a coffee shop across from a man in a dark suit, and beside them were documents marked with the signs of a federal agency. "His name is Dalton Price," Hal said, his voice carrying through the still room, "a federal agent who has been chasing our family for years. And this is your wife, sitting across from him months before the night you supposedly found her by chance in your own restaurant. Do you truly believe that was an accident, Tobias? A disbarred lawyer, desperate, appearing exactly when you needed a wife most. She has been digging through our books for weeks. I can show you every query she made at night. She was not looking for vulnerabilities for you. She was gathering evidence for them." Joanna shot up from her chair. "That is a lie," she said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "I met Price once, only once, before any of this happened, and it was because he approached me about an old case. I have never worked for him. Those photographs have been cut out of context, and the numbers I have been tracing lead straight back to you, Hal." She turned to Tobias, and what she saw on his face made her heart seem to stop. He was not shouting, not raging. Worse than that, he had withdrawn inward, his face closing into a cold mask she had not seen since that first night on the balcony. She could see his mind working, weighing, and that was the most frightening thing of all, because he was not stupid, and it was his intelligence that was turning against her. Because for a man who had buried his father 8 months ago because the wrong person had been trusted, for a man who had sworn never to be caught unprepared again, the coincidence Hal had just laid before him was a perfect poison, mixed in exactly the right dose to strike his deepest fear. "You have been digging through the books," Tobias said, his voice so quiet and flat it was chilling, "for weeks. At night, and you did not say one word to me." It was not a question, and Joanna realized with cold despair that her own secrecy, the very decision to act alone that she had believed was wise, had now become the rope around her neck. "I kept it secret because I did not know who I could trust," she said, her voice almost pleading. "I was trying to protect you. Just like everyone always says, he answered, and he turned away, no longer looking at her. Take her out of here, he said to Hal's two men, each word a shard of ice. Take her away until I know the truth. When strange hands closed around her arms and pulled her from the room, Joanna did not struggle, did not scream. She only stared at the back of the man she loved, the man who had just turned away from her exactly as Hal had intended. And in that darkest moment, amid the pain tearing through her heart, the remaining cold part of her reason whispered another truth. He did not hate her. He was afraid. And a man this afraid, a man this carefully manipulated, could still be pulled back to the truth. If she was strong enough not to break first. They took her to a small house separated from the rest of the estate, a place that had once housed the housekeeper, and left her there alone behind a locked door, with the warning that she would remain there until Tobias decided her fate. Joanna sat on the edge of the strange bed in the dark and did not cry, because tears were a luxury she would not allow herself now. Instead, she forced her mind to work, turning over every move, every piece, searching for a way out of the maze Hal had trapped her inside. It was well past midnight when she heard a key turn softly in the lock, and she sprang to her feet, her whole body tightening as she prepared for the worst. The door opened, and the person who stepped into the dim light was Connor. Joanna's entire body went rigid, and she backed toward the corner of the room, both hands clenched. "What are you here for?" she said, her voice cold and sharp. "I heard you on the phone that night. I heard you say Hal's name. So you're part of this too, did you come to silence me?" Connor stood still at the threshold, not moving closer, his hands open and hanging at his sides in the deliberate way of a man trying to show he meant no harm. "You heard half the story, Miss Reyes," he said quietly, "and you filled in the rest with your fear. I don't blame you. In this house, suspicion is what keeps people alive. But this time you suspected the wrong person." He closed the door behind him, still keeping his distance, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight she had never heard before. "I served Tobias's father for 20 years. He pulled me out of the mud when I was nothing, and I swore a vow I still keep even though he's gone. When he was killed, I knew at once it was not an enemy from the outside. I knew it came from within, from someone who carried his own blood, but I had no proof, and an accusation without proof aimed at Hal would only get me killed the way Tobias's father was killed." Joanna still had not moved from the corner, but she had begun to listen. "So I did the hardest thing I have ever done," Connor said, and for the first time, his voice revealed a deep exhaustion. "I pretended to lean toward Hal. I let him believe I had chosen the winning side, that I was like all the others, ready to betray when the wind changed. The call you overheard that night was me drawing information out of one of his men, letting him believe I would handle my part when he moved against Tobias. I have been playing this game for months, alone, not daring to tell anyone, not even Tobias, because he was hurting so badly he could not have hidden it, and one wrong glance from him would have been enough to make Hal suspicious." Joanna looked at him for a long time, the lawyer's instinct inside her weighing every word, searching for gaps, for signs of a lie, but all she saw was the naked truth of a man who had carried a secret alone for far too long. "Why do you trust me?" she asked softly. "How do you know I'm not Price's person the way Hal said?" "Because I have been watching you since the first day you walked through that gate," Connor answered. "I saw you cry beside your mother's bed. I saw the way you look at Tobias when he is not paying attention. Federal people do not look at someone that way, and more important, I know you have been following the same path I have been following for months. You found the money trail. You found Hal. You are only missing the final piece." He stepped closer, and this time she did not retreat, and from inside his coat he took out a small phone and placed it in her hand. "This is what I risked everything to get," he said. A recording. Hal's own voice, talking about the night Tobias's father died, clear enough that no one can deny it. "I cannot take it to Tobias myself, because he would ask why I had gotten so close to Hal, and the whole play would collapse. But you can. You have the numbers, and now you have the voice. Put them together, and we have the thing both of us have been searching for." Joanna looked down at the phone in her palm, then lifted her eyes to the man who had just gone from the trader. She thought he was to the only ally she had, and in that moment, inside the small dark house where she was being held, she felt something she had lost long ago begin to spark again in her chest. Hope. Connor left her with the phone, and a way out, a back door the guard would ignore for exactly 1 hour before dawn, And then he vanished into the darkness to return to his dangerous role before his absence could be discovered. Joanna did not waste a single minute. She no longer had the quiet of the study, no longer had long nights to carefully follow every thread the way she had when she first uncovered the money trail. This time she was racing against time, and against an enemy who now knew she was a threat. She slipped out in the gray light of morning, caught a ride to the only place she could still trust, Maeve's old apartment, and there, on the cramped dining table between cups of cold coffee, she laid out everything she had and began building the only weapon that could save her. She matched the recording of Hal's voice to the money trail she had traced, comparing every date, every shell company name, every transaction, until all of it locked together into a picture no judge, no counsel could deny. Hal had been siphoning family money to build his own power. And the recording showed that he was the one who had ordered the night Tobias's father fell. But Joanna was wise enough to know that if she brought the evidence to Tobias herself now, he would only see the woman Hal had just convinced him was a spy, and everything she said would be doubted. He needed to find the truth himself, needed to believe it with his own eyes, and not through the words of someone he had turned away from. So she did the thing only a legal mind would think to do. She copied the entire chain of evidence, both the numbers and the recording, and skillfully embedded it inside the very doc file she knew Tobias would have to open for the upcoming meeting, placing it where only he, with the care of a man who never signed anything without reading closely, would be able to find it. She left him a path to walk toward the truth on his own, a thread for him to untangle himself, because she knew that a truth a person discovered for himself always carried more weight than a truth forced into his ear. She had just finished sending that file through an intermediary Connor had arranged when her phone vibrated, and when she saw the name on the screen, her blood seemed to freeze. It was the number of the hospital where her mother was staying, but the voice on the other end was not a nurse's. It was low, calm, and carried the false gentleness she had learned to fear. "Miss Reyes," Hal said, "you are a far smarter woman than I expected, and that is precisely the problem. I had hoped to settle this more neatly, but you could not sit still where you were left, could you? Now I think it is time you and I speak directly, before you have a chance to do something that will make both of us regret it. And so you understand that I am very serious. I want you to know your mother is with my people right now. She is still well. She will continue to be well, as long as you do exactly what I say." Joanna's entire world narrowed to one white point of terror, and she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. The only woman she had left, the fragile mother she had sacrificed everything to protect, was now in the hands of a man who would stop at nothing. "If you dare touch her," she said, her voice trembling but not begging, "there will be nowhere on earth for you to hide from what will come for you." "I do not intend to harm anyone, as long as you cooperate," Hal replied, still in that smooth voice. "Come to the harbor, alone. Bring everything you have found, every copy, every scrap of paper. And do not tell Tobias, because if you do, I will know. You have 1 hour." The line went dead, leaving Joanna standing in the small kitchen in a silence so deep it felt fatal. Her heart torn in two between the mother being held and the truth she had just sent away, and she realized that every move she had calculated now led to one place, the dark harbor where everything would be decided. What Hal had not anticipated was that the doc file in which Joanna had planted the evidence reached Tobias earlier than he had calculated, and at the very hour Hal was forcing her toward the harbor, the man he believed he had successfully manipulated was sitting alone in the study, turning each page with the meticulous care of someone who had never signed anything without reading all the way to the final line. And he found it. He listened to the recording in absolute silence, the voice of his own uncle confessing to the night that had taken his father from him, and in that moment, every broken piece of the past 8 months suddenly locked together into a truth that chilled him to the bone. She had not betrayed him. She had been trying to save him, alone, in the dark, even after he had turned his back on her. But before he could act, Hal made one last reckless move. He summoned the council, all the most powerful families in the city, to the very old mansion where Joanna had been introduced to the council, and when Tobias entered the room full of measuring eyes, Hal was already standing in the center, wrapped in the disguise of a grieving uncle, forced to do something bitter for the common good. "My nephew has allowed emotion to cloud his judgment," Hal declared, his voice carrying through the room. He has brought a traitor into our house, a woman working for the federal government, and when I tried to warn him, he still refused to listen. A leader who cannot control his own household is not fit to lead us. I propose that the council force Tobias Falcone to relinquish his position, and to preserve the honor of the family, I am prepared to shoulder that responsibility. The entire room went still, and Hal turned to Tobias with that deadly gentle smile of his. Of course, you still have a choice. Your wife is safe under my supervision. You need only step down quietly, hand everything over, and I promise to let her and her sick mother live in peace. Power or the woman, choose. It was the perfect trap, set before men who had always believed that in this world, power was the one thing a man would never trade away, and all of them waited for Tobias to do what any boss would do, to choose the chair. But Tobias Falcone took one step forward, and when he spoke, his voice was terrifyingly calm. You want me to choose between power and her, he said. Then I am going to disappoint you because for me that has never been a difficult choice. Take the chair, take the empire, take the harbor, take everything my father left behind. I will lay it all down right now, without hesitation, if that is the price of keeping her safe. A murmur of astonishment spread through the room, and if Joanna had been there, she would have understood that the man who had once said no one had ever asked whether he wanted this life had just answered that question himself for the first time. But before I stepped down, Tobias continued, and his voice suddenly hardened like steel. This council deserves to hear one thing. My uncle has just spoken of betrayal. Then let all of us hear what true betrayal sounds like. He pulled out the phone, and Hal's own voice rang through the deathly silent room, confessing to the night his brother fell, each word dropping like stones nailing shut a coffin. Hal's kindly face went white, then twisted into something lonely and panicked, and when he saw the council's eyes beginning to turn toward him, full of suspicion and disgust, he understood that the game had turned. But a beast backed into a corner is the most dangerous beast of all. Hal retreated toward the door, and the mad smile on his face chilled even Tobias. That sounds beautiful, nephew, he hissed, but the recording won't save her. My people are taking her to the harbor right now. If you want your wife alive, you had better pray you can run faster than I can. Then he turned and bolted through the door, and Tobias, without bothering to look back at the stunned council behind him, ran after him, his heart beating for the first time in his life with one single fear, that he would arrive too late. The harbor at night was a maze of steel and darkness, containers stacked into silent walls beneath sickly yellow lights. Joanna was led through that maze to an empty warehouse at the edge of the water, where her mother was sitting in a chair, exhausted and afraid but still safe, watched by men Joanna did not know. When she saw her mother, every fear for herself vanished, replaced by an iron resolve, and she walked into the center of the warehouse with the folder in her hand, her head held high exactly as Gia had taught her from the first days. Hal arrived soon after, no longer wearing his kindly mask, but showing himself as a man cornered at the end of the road, his eyes shining with the dangerous light of someone who had nothing left to lose. Hand it over, he said, reaching out, every copy. Then I will let you and your mother go. Joanna knew he was lying, knew that the moment she surrendered the only thing protecting her, neither she nor her mother would have any value left to him. And she also knew she had to buy time, had to believe that somewhere in the dark, the truth she had sent away was on its way to find them. You will not let us go, she said, taking one step back, keeping the folder pressed to her chest. But you will not get this as easily as you think. At the very moment Hal stepped toward her, the warehouse door burst open, and Tobias entered, Connor close beside him, along with a group of loyal men who had quietly assembled. For one instant, everything seemed to stop, the two sides facing each other in the flickering light, and Hal's men, realizing they had been outnumbered and that their master was now the defeated one, began to falter. A few dropped their hands in surrender the moment Connor reminded them that loyalty placed in the wrong hands was the thing that buried men fastest. The struggle was brief and decisive. Not a battle, but the collapse of a force that had lost all ground beneath it. And within minutes, Hal's men had been subdued, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the warehouse, isolated exactly as he had always been at heart. Tobias walked toward his uncle, and in every step he took were 8 months of pain, the image of his father falling in his arms, and all the fury a son could carry. He came close to Hal, and the entire warehouse held its breath. because everyone knew the Wolf of the Harbor had both the right and the reason to end everything here and now, in the way their world had always ended things. Hal knew it too, and for the first time, real fear appeared on his face. In that moment, when anger rose to its highest point and Tobias's hand had already tightened, he caught Joanna's eyes across the warehouse. She did not say a word, did not plead, only looked at him, and in that gaze he saw everything she had awakened in him. The woman who had asked whether he had ever been allowed to choose his own path. The woman who believed that even in darkness, a person could still keep one thing to hold on to. And Tobias made his choice. He released his hand. "No," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "I will not become what you turned my father into. I will not give you an easy death in the dark, where you can become a story, a mystery, a martyr. You will face what you have done before every person you betrayed." He turned to Connor. "Call the council here. All of them. Let them hear him speak the truth himself, with his own mouth." And beneath the cold lights of the warehouse, surrounded by witnesses he could no longer buy or threaten, Hal finally collapsed, his confession pouring out in the absolute loneliness of a man who had traded every human bond for power and now had nothing left. Joanna ran to her mother and wrapped her arms around her, and when she looked up through her tears, she caught Tobias's eyes on her, and in that gaze there was no longer the coldness of the night he had turned away, only a silent apology and something far deeper, something that had finally been allowed to have a name. The weeks after the night at the harbor passed like a receding tide, revealing ground beneath that had been changed forever. Hal's collapse pulled other things down with it, things even Joanna had not fully foreseen, because when one link in the darkness was dragged into the light, the others began to show themselves too. It turned out that Agent Dalton Price, the man Hal had used to slander her, had never truly been targeting Tobias or Joanna at all. All that time, he had been quietly investigating the dirty money Hal had been siphoning away to build a hidden empire of his own. When Joanna, through an intermediary lawyer and with Tobias's consent, turned over to the federal agency the very evidence she had worked so hard to build, the case Price had pursued for years finally had what it needed, and the full weight of the law came down on the person who deserved to bear it. But what made Joanna's heart beat hard was not the fall of an enemy, but something she had not dared dream of for the past 18 months. Among the files reopened in the shock that followed, the truth about the Hartwell Holdings case finally rose to the surface. When investigators began tracing the falsified documents, they found what Preston Wade had believed he had buried forever, the mark of his own hand on the numbers he had placed on her head. Joanna did not need Tobias's power or money to force anyone, exactly as she had demanded on that first night on the balcony. She only needed the truth placed on the right table, before the right people with authority, and once it was there, it spoke for itself. The process of restoring her law license was officially set in motion, and this time, instead of standing alone before the board as the accused, she walked in with a chain of evidence as solid as stone, and her honor being returned to her piece by piece. Preston, the man who had snapped his fingers at her like she was an object, and asked whether she still had not found a husband, now had to face the very truth he had believed he could bury beneath a woman's career. One afternoon, as the late autumn sunlight poured through the tall windows of the study, Tobias found Joanna standing by the window and looking down at the lake, and he came to stand beside her, sharing a long silence before he spoke. "Our contract," he said softly, 90 days. It is almost over. You have done everything you promised and more. You are free, Joanna, completely free. Exactly as the clause you demanded said, and exactly as the clause I crossed out with my own hand allowed. You can walk out of this door right now, taking your life back, your career back, with no chain clinging to you at all." Joanna turned to look at him, and in those gray eyes she saw the fear he was trying to hide, the fear of someone far too used to everything he cherished leaving him. "You are giving me the chance to leave," she said. "Do you think I will?" "I think you deserve to choose," he answered. "You asked me whether I had ever been allowed to choose my own path. I cannot turn back time and choose for myself, but I can let you choose for yourself." Joanna was silent for a long while, looking out over the lake, then back at the man who had gone from a frightening name to the first person in years who had truly seen her. "Then I choose to stay," she said. "But not to be an ornament in your world, and not to be swallowed by the darkness you were born into. I am staying to change it." You have an entire empire, Tobias, and most of it can stand in the sunlight if someone smart enough leads it out of the shadows. The harbor, the real estate, the restaurants. Let me help you turn it into something you do not have to hide, something you may one day be proud to leave behind for whoever comes after you. Tobias looked at her, and on the face that had once made powerful men rethink their calculations, something broke open and softened at the same time. Do you know, he said quietly, I went looking for a wife to save my chair. I did not know I was looking for someone to save me from myself and Joanna. The woman the world had once taught to believe she was nothing, smiled, because for the first time, she understood that her worth had never belonged in the hands of those who had rejected her. 6 months later, Aurelio's was once again lit for a party, but this time Joanna Reyes did not enter through the back door, meant for servers. She came through the main entrance, wearing a simple yet elegant dress, walking beside the man who owned the entire building. She was no longer the girl carrying trays in a uniform that smelled faintly of dishwater, nor the woman who had learned to disappear in order to preserve the last scraps of her dignity. Her law license had been restored only a few weeks earlier, and now she moved through the room that had once witnessed her humiliation with a calmness meant not to prove anything to anyone, but because she had stopped needing recognition from people who had never deserved her concern. And then, as if fate had arranged one final irony, she saw Preston Wade in the corner of the room, the man now looking far more worn down and small than the image she carried in her memory. His career shaken after the truth about Hartwell was exposed, his eyes sliding away from her as if avoiding something he did not want to face. For one moment, the cruel question he had once snapped at her came echoing back through her mind, still not married, and she almost laughed, not from bitterness, but from realizing how small that question had become, because her worth had never lived inside the answer to it. He had once believed that a woman without a husband was a failed woman, and that petty belief was exactly why he had never been able to see the real person standing in front of him. Tobias seemed to feel the current of thought passing through her, and he gently placed a hand against her back, not with the possessive gesture of that first night, but with the tenderness of someone who only wanted her to know he was there. They stepped out onto the balcony, the very balcony where everything had begun, where the wind from Lake Michigan still rose salty and cold as it had that night, and standing there, looking down at the harbor that now belonged to a different future, Tobias turned to her with an honesty only she was allowed to see. You know, he said softly, the night I walked in there and called you my wife, I thought I was saving you. I was wrong. A man could live for 6 centuries and still not learn what you taught me in only a few months. That power is not what makes a man worthy, and that the most frightening thing is not the enemy outside the gate, but losing yourself in the dark. You did not save me from Hal. You saved me from the man I was slowly becoming. You saw something in me that even I had forgotten still existed, and you believed in it until I could believe in it too. Joanna placed her hand over his on the railing. We have both been defined by other people, she said. You were defined by a world you were born into and never allowed to choose. I was defined by a cruel question in a case I never caused. But no one has the right to decide our worth except us. I do not need you to promise me a perfect fairy tale, because I no longer believe in perfect things. I only need you to promise that every day, we will choose together to become better people than we were the day before. Tobias took her hand, and the promise he gave her did not rise in flowery words, but in the eyes of a man who had finally found what all the power in the world could never buy for him. And standing there, 2 people once rejected and looked down upon by the whole world found in each other not a place to hide, but a place to begin again, a place where, for the first time, they were seen exactly as they truly were. The story of Joanna and Tobias leaves us with something simple yet profound, that the value of a human being is never measured by status, wealth, whether they have married or not, or by the things others try to attach to them in the worst moments of their lives. Dignity is something no one can take from us unless we allow it, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to keep standing straight when the whole world wants them to bow their head. Kindness and trust, even when offered to someone who seems to have lost every trace of humanity, still have the power to awaken the good that has been sleeping inside them. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can listen to many more compelling and meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about the story of Joanna and Tobias, so please leave a comment and share the thoughts that come from deep within your heart, because every line you write is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very final moment. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, serenity, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.